What is going on, my friend Danny here from youngat30.com, and in this video I'm going to talk about how we can prevent and even reverse type 2 diabetes naturally. Now before I get started, quick disclaimer, don't take the content of this video as medical advice. I'm no expert, I'm just sharing with you the best that I've learned from the experts. Now that being said, if you would like to apply some of the strategies that I'm going to talk about, then I would implore you to do a little bit more research and then consult with a professional before you get started. So let's jump in. So what is diabetes and why do we want to prevent it or reverse it in the first place? Well, diabetes is what's called a metabolic disease. Now, what is a metabolic disease? Well, very broadly speaking, a metabolic disease is where the process of extracting energy from food and then either storing that energy or using that energy is disrupted somehow. And in the case of diabetes, that disruption leads to there just being too much sugar in the blood. And that's what diabetes basically boils down to. We just have too much sugar in the blood. And when we have too much sugar in the blood, that can actually lead to quite drastic consequences. It can lead to fatty liver disease, it can lead to kidney damage, it can lead to heart disease, it can lead to blindness, it can lead to infection, and the list goes on and on. So there are a few reasons why we just don't want to get diabetes in the first place. Well, what actually causes diabetes to begin with? Well, in order to explain this, I need to talk about what happens when we eat. Now, I'm sure you're aware that glucose or sugar are our body's number one nutrient, our number one fuel source. So when we eat, we actually extract sugar from food, and that sugar is either in its natural form in the food or it's locked away in carbohydrates, and we break down the carbohydrates to release the sugar and release the glucose and release the energy. But when we do this, the sugar eventually ends up in our bloodstream. And what we want to do is we want to move that glucose from the blood into our cells. That's the goal. So basically we'll eat food and the sugar ends up in our blood and we move it from the blood into our cells. But how do we do that? Well, it's actually done through the production of a hormone that's produced in the pancreas called insulin. And the insulin acts as a signal for us to shuttle that sugar from our blood into our cells. So basically the insulin is a signal for us to store energy, and when we're not producing insulin, it's actually a signal for us to burn energy. Now that's a really key principle, and it's the kind of heart of this video, so I'll say it again because it's quite important. So insulin, when we produce insulin, is a signal for us to store energy, and when we're not producing insulin in the pancreas, it's a signal for us to burn energy. So that's the key premise. So I mentioned already that diabetes is where we have too much sugar in the blood, and that is because of two reasons. Either because the pancreas isn't making enough insulin to begin with, or the pancreas is actually making insulin, but we're not actually responding to the message that the insulin is trying to give for us to shuttle the sugar from the blood into the cells. And it turns out there are two types of diabetes, which I'm sure you know. There's type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes is based on the first reason, when the pancreas is just not producing enough insulin in the first place. And type 1 diabetes is what's called an autoimmune disease. Now, if you like to watch House like I do, the series House, you'll know they band around that term quite a lot, but what is actually an autoimmune disease? Well, an autoimmune disease is when our immune system actually attack healthy cells because they think they're foreign, which is not good. And in the case of diabetes, our immune system will actually attack the cells in the pancreas that are responsible for producing the insulin. They're called insulin producing beta cells. So when that happens, obviously we'll get a buildup of sugar in the blood because we're not getting a strong enough signal for us to move that sugar from our blood into our cells. So that's type 1 diabetes. It's an autoimmune disease, and it's basically when the pancreas does not produce enough insulin. Now, type 2 diabetes is different. It's not an autoimmune disease, and it's basically thought to be caused by lifestyle. And it hits us from the age of around 40 or 40 plus. And of course, there's always exceptions, but it's believed to be caused by poor diet and poor exercise. And it's where basically the pancreas is producing insulin, but our bodies are not responding to the message that the insulin is trying to give. And that message is obviously that we need to move the sugar from our blood into our cells. So it turns out that over time, the more sugar that we eat, the more insulin that we need to, our pancreases need to pump out to get that signal for us to move the sugar from our blood into our cells. And over time, because we keep doing that, our bodies actually become desensitized or resistant to the insulin. So what happens is the pancreas, in order to compensate for that resistance, it pumps out even more insulin. And if we keep eating more and more sugar, we end up in this downward spiral. And eventually we'll reach a point when the pancreas is just pumping out insulin, but the body just doesn't respond to it anymore, doesn't respond to the message. And then we get this build-up of glucose in the blood, which is really bad. And our bodies just become bloated with sugar. Our cells are full of it and our bloodstreams are full of it. And this is really bad. So one of the world's leading experts on treating diabetes naturally is a guy called Dr. Jason Fung. And basically he says when we have too much blood in the sugar, it actually causes the body to rot from the inside out, which is pretty nasty stuff. And that can lead to amputation, and we really don't want that. So we want to avoid diabetes at all costs. So that is type 2 diabetes. It's when the pancreas is actually producing insulin, but we've become resistant to the insulin and we're not getting the message that we need to move the sugar from our bloodstream into our cells, and that is said to be caused through lifestyle. So how do we, actually before I go into the how, a good analogy of this and how important it is when we eat so much sugar, our bodies, as I say, they become bloated with sugar and our cells become bloated. So you can kind of imagine that your cells are like sponges and the sugar is like water. So basically if we spill some water and we mop it up with a sponge, initially the sponge will do a really good job. It will mop up the water, but eventually it will expand and it'll reach a point where it just hasn't got any more capacity to get more water in there. There's just no more room. And you can think about your cells being the same kind of, or applying the same, or following the same kind of rules when it comes to soaking up glucose. So cells do need glucose, they like glucose, they need it. But eventually if the cells become too packed with glucose, there's just no more room for it to go. So the glucose just kind of hangs around in the bloodstream, and that leads to this disease and the kind of rotting of the body, which you really don't want. So type 2 diabetes is not autoimmune, so it's easier to treat, which is why it's the topic of this video. So how do we actually prevent or reverse type 2 diabetes? Well, we do it through lifestyle changes. So I've already mentioned that diabetes is basically when we have too much sugar in the blood. So what we want to do is we want to get the sugar out of our blood and into our cells, or just get rid of that sugar basically, because we have too much in the bodies. Now, how do we do that? Well, it's very simple. It's a really simple principle. We burn it. We burn the sugar and we burn energy. It sounds simple, and that's because it is simple, but it's not easy because it involves lifestyle changes, and we're humans, so even when a lifestyle change can give us loads of benefits, we really struggle to change our life. So the premise is the strategies are very easy. They're very simple, but they're not easy. So we change our lifestyle and we want to burn the sugar in our bodies. And obviously because our bodies are already bloated with sugar and our cells are full of sugar, we don't want to keep taking in more sugar because that's not going to help. Now Bruce Lee has a great quote. He says, why add to a problem while you're working on it? Which I think really applies to this situation. So I'm going to talk about 4 strategies, 4 methods that you can apply to help prevent diabetes or reverse it if you're in that place and you need to. Now the first one is the obvious one, and that's the kind of crux of it, is to kind of cut your sugar intake. This is all about sugar and there being too much sugar, so obviously we just want to eliminate sugar if possible. So cut out processed, cut out table sugar, cut out processed foods, cut out soda, and ideally you want to cut out your carbs, so things like rice, pasta, bread, grains, just cut those out as well. And if you do that, we are basically, we're not producing as much insulin because we don't need to, and we're giving our bodies a chance to burn off the sugar that's already in there. So that's the first way, is cut out sugar from your diets, cut out sugar from your lifestyle. Number 2 is through being more active. Now, the goal is to burn sugar, and we do that through movement, we do that through using our bodies and burning energy, basically. So you want to get exercise, try and exercise every day if you can. It doesn't matter how you do it, be it going to the gym, be it going for a run, be it playing sports, whatever you want to do, just make sure you're exercising and moving more. And walk more as well, that's a simple strategy. Don't take the car as much, walk more, just sit down less. If you work in an office and you're sitting down all day, ideally you want to get up and move around at least once an hour, ideally twice an hour, just keep moving your body. You know, if you're on your lunch break, go for a walk, just stay active basically, and that'll help kind of burn the sugar. So that's the second method, is just being more active. Now the third method is actually through fasting. One of my favorite subjects. I talk about fasting a lot because the number of benefits you get from fasting are just ridiculous. But in our case, fasting is a really great strategy because, well, I mentioned earlier that when we eat, we produce insulin, and insulin is a signal for us to store energy. And when we're not producing insulin, i.e. we're not eating, the message is for us to burn energy. So what we want to do, we want to extend that signal as long as possible, and we do that by not eating for as long as possible, and that's done through fasting. So fasting is where you don't have any food and you just have water. Now it turns out it takes about a day or two for us to burn off our existing kind of sugar reserves through fasting, about a day or two and you'll be there. Now that's obviously not sustainable forever, so if you don't fancy just fasting for too long, you can try intermittent fasting, and that's the kind of the in-between point, and it's where you restrict your calorie intake or your feeding time to a limited number of hours in the day. And the guide I hear a lot is if you eat within a 12-hour window and then you go 12 hours with just water, that will qualify as intermittent fasting, and we're extending that signal because we're not producing the insulin that we need to burn fuel rather than store it. Now personally, I like to go and eat within an 8-hour window and go 16 hours with just water. Obviously the longer that we can go, the more benefits we'll get. So that is the third method, and that's a really powerful strategy. And again, I mentioned earlier a chap called Dr. Jason Fung, who's like one of the world's leading experts in this area, and that's his kind of primary strategy. So I implore you to go and have a read of his material to learn more about it. Now the fourth method is actually through being in ketosis, which again you might not have heard of. I do talk about ketosis quite a lot. I've written a series of articles on my blog, so if you want to know more details, head on over to youngat30.com and just click the ketosis section, and I've got a few articles on there that you can read more about. But very broadly speaking, ketosis is where we're burning fat as our primary fuel source rather than sugar. And we can only get into that metabolic state of ketosis once our sugar stores have been depleted, which is great, that's what we want. So when you're in ketosis, you're in a state of constantly burning fuel rather than storing fuel. And we're burning fat, and we have pretty much unlimited reserves of fat, as opposed to sugar, which we can only store in a very finite amount. So get into ketosis, and we do that through, the main way is through a ketogenic diet. And again, I won't go into too much detail now, but a ketogenic diet is where we get the majority of our macronutrients from fats. We have very little carbs, hardly any at all, and we have like low to moderate protein. And that's a ketogenic diet, and that's ideal for us because we're burning energy all the time and we're not storing it. So those are the 4 methods, and I'll just recap on everything that we talked about very briefly to wrap up. So diabetes is bad because when we get diabetes, we have too much sugar in the blood, and when we have too much sugar in the blood, that can lead to all kinds of problems. That the rotting of the body is the big one, but we get kind of kidney disease and fatty liver disease and heart disease, blindness, etc., etc. So if at all possible, we want to prevent getting into or having diabetes in the first place. Now, type 2 diabetes, which is the kind of focus of this video, is caused when the pancreas is making insulin, but our bodies have become desensitized or resistant to that insulin, so our bodies aren't getting the message that we need to move the sugar from our blood into our cells, and that is primarily caused through lifestyle, poor diet and not exercising. So in theory, we can actually reverse type 2 diabetes or treat it or prevent it by changing our lifestyle, and we want to do that by burning sugar as much as possible and not getting more sugar into our bodies while we're doing that. We don't want to add to the problem while we're working on it. And the 4 ways you can do that, the kind of 4 key principles. Number 1, cut sugar from your diet. So cut out soda, cut out table sugar, cut out carbs, cut out your rice, pasta and bread, etc. and that will kind of cut enough sugar from your diets and help to burn the sugar that's already in there without adding to it. The second method is being more active, so exercise more, walk more, and sit as little as possible, basically. Number 3 is fasting or intermittent fasting. So again, when we're not eating, we're not producing insulin, and that is the signal for us to burn energy rather than store it. So if we go through periods of no eating, we will kind of burn fuel rather than actually store it, which is ideal for us. That's what we want. Method 4 is being in ketosis, and basically being in ketosis is when we use fat as our primary fuel source rather than sugar, and we can only get into ketosis in the first place once our sugar stores have been depleted. So that really helps us with treating diabetes. So if we apply these strategies, basically we are limiting the amount of insulin that we produce every day significantly, and that's what we want, because over time the theory is that our bodies will resensitize to that insulin. So eventually we'll get to the point when we make insulin, we actually respond to that message, and we actually shuttle the sugar from our blood into our cells, and that is what we want to kind of function healthily and not have diabetes. So that is it. I hope you enjoyed the video. That is how to prevent and reverse type 2 diabetes naturally. If you like the video, please hit the like button, and if you'd like to see more videos like this one, hit the subscribe button, and of course comment if you like. And that's it. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.